Hello, and welcome to the Games Industry Talks. This week we have Ramon here. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce his last name, but I'm sure he can do it soon. Talking to us about level motifs and how to merge level design and game design, I believe. Hello, Ramon.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. So yeah, hi everybody. Thank you for coming to my talk on motifing. Motifing is basically a level design process. So this is mostly going to be interesting for level designers, but of course, most people in the industry are going to be interacting with level designers or with levels in general. So hopefully this is still going to be relevant. My name is Ramon Huiskamp. That's how you pronounce it. I'm an indie developer at my own studio, Roofkat. I've had this company for a couple of years now, but only a couple of weeks ago, I started going full-time with it. So now I'm full-time working on my own projects, which is very exciting and new. I started studying at Breda University, graduated from there, then worked for Sumo Digital for a couple of years, worked on Sackboy Big Adventure. And then recently I worked No Breaks Games in Tenerife. And now I moved back and I'm working on my own stuff. So throughout this talk, I'm going to be telling you all about level motifs. First of all, explaining what it is that I'm talking about when I'm saying level motif. Then because it is a tool, it can be relevant in different degrees depending on what your project is and what you want to use it for. Then I'm going to talk about using those motifs to prove out gameplay, using them to actually build levels. And finally, I'm going to give you essentially an example of a level design process that uses motifs. And then I'm going to take you through that with just a quick project that I set up to give you an idea of how this might work in practice. So starting very much at the beginning, if you've heard of motifs before, you've probably heard of it in different media, a visual motif, narrative motif, audio motif, anything like that. Obviously, these all refer to different things, but they have a lot of overlap in their meaning. They're usually a small element of something bigger, often recurring, and they often have something that you can interpret metaphorically. As we're in the games industry, we're ignoring most of that. We're ignoring most of the conventions other media uses. When I'm talking about a level motif, I'm just talking about it being a smaller element of a bigger level. It doesn't necessarily need to have something that's recurring or some metaphorical meaning to it. To define that a little bit more clearly, a level motif is a small piece of unique playable content, which whatever exactly that means depends on what project you're making. So it can be a single puzzle, it can be a short enemy encounter, it can be a platforming challenge, anything like that. Said a little bit of what it is. Let me tell you what it is not. It is not a final piece of the level. The idea is that a motif is essentially a small piece of a gray box. It's like a step in the level design process. It's not actually a final bit of the level. It's also not a gym or a playground or whatever you might call a place you use to just test mechanics and your metrics. This level motif, it has to be something that's actually playable and it has some level design intent. It can actually inform what eventually turns into a final level. So this is what a motif can look like at the top right. A very simple setup with a couple of gameplay elements that can be played through, completely isolated from anything else. So you can judge it purely just on this bit of gameplay. And you would make a number of these motifs. And then after going through a selection process, if you would pick this one, it would get iterated on. The lengths between all of these elements would be just right. Would receive art, might turn into a final section of the level, similar to what you see in the bottom right over there from Sackboy Big Adventure. Small disclaimer, the upper picture I just mocked up for this presentation. That's not a screenshot from when we were working on Sackboy Big Adventure. So you might be aware that we don't have a very homogeneous terminology in this industry. Every studio uses different terms. So that you've not heard of level motifing might not mean that you've never used a similar process. It might just mean that you've known it as a different name. And this also means that if you join another studio and they explain to you a certain process that sounds a lot like level motifing, might essentially be the same, just under some different term. So I've heard of it as action blocks, and I've also heard of it as gameplay moments. All of these are fine. I actually don't think motifing is necessarily the best name for this project, this process, but it's what I'm used to, so that's why I'm going to stick with it. I just want to let you know there are other names for this similar process out there. Now that we know a little bit about motifs, let's talk about whether it's actually relevant for you to use. So these are some of the games that were made using a version of motifing. The term originated at Media Molecule, and they use it for Little Big Planet, Eventually, that moved over to Sumo Digital when they were working on Little Big Planet 3 and Sackboy Big Adventure, which is where I got to know it. But also a similar process was used in a game called Titanfall 2. And they called it differently. They had a different term for it, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But one thing that these games, which seem quite different, Titanfall and Sackboy, one thing that they have in common is that they're both very gameplay and level design heavy. And that is exactly what motifing works very well for, because motifs are short pieces of gameplay to be used within a level. So any projects heavy on those, this is going to be very relevant. So something like a logic puzzle game, every puzzle can essentially be a motif. Platformers, you can set up interesting traversal challenges as motifs and then craft your level out of that. And for action games with levels, you can use motifs to test out combat encounters, action sequences, anything as such. On the flip side, motifing is less relevant if the focus is not on your moment-to-moment gameplay. It may still be usable in to create some level motifs for the actual bits of direct moment-to-moment gameplay within the narrative that happen, but it's not as useful to use this for every step of your game. Same with games about something like long-term strategy. It's hard to motif deck building, but you could motif an individual mechanic that you use within a combat encounter. Regardless of your actual project, however, motifs can be relevant to you in two specific situations. First of all, if you're not sure whether certain gameplay will work and you need to prove either to yourself or to others that it is going to work, or when you're actually building levels, you can use motifs to make them in a sort of step-by-step basis. So first going to talk about the former, using motifs to prove out gameplay. When I'm talking about proving out gameplay, this could be a new mechanic that you're adding to the game. It could be a type of game mode, anything, literally any new type of gameplay that you're adding to your game. You want to make sure that whatever this is, this kind of gameplay is that you're adding to the game is going to be valuable. It's going to add valuable content, and you can use it hopefully in a number of different ways. So to prove that out, you need obviously a very rough version of that working in the engine. And this, if some functionality exists for it, maybe a programmer has already made a prototype for it, that's fantastic. But if not, try and make a rough approximation for yourself. It's fine to just get some assets from the asset store if you're using something like Unreal or Unity. Or just, let's say you're testing a new vehicle, you might want to make a rough version of how the vehicle controls with just placing a box, adding some cylinders, and then adding your own functionality to it if you're able to do that. Otherwise, request it from somebody. Then in order to prove out that this type of gameplay is interesting, you make a number of different motifs. I'll go in more in depth on actually making motifs later in this talk, but here essentially you create a lot of different examples of how whatever gameplay you're trying to prove could actually be used. So again, we're talking about you're adding a new vehicle to your game. You can try and make a bunch of motifs where you use this vehicle to smash through a wall or you drive off a ramp, but also maybe some more basic stuff like taking a turn around through a corridor, driving through a tunnel. After you've made a number of these, you keep making a number of them, a number more motifs, keep iterating both on the motifs and the way that your gameplay works. And hopefully by doing this, you will find the best ways of using this gameplay. Or you might come to the conclusion that this type of gameplay that you wanted to add to your game is not going to work for whatever reason. And that is super helpful to know. It's really useful to know whether a new feature that you're adding provides a variety of gameplay possibilities or whether it is not going to be interesting enough for your particular game. If you're planning to base a level on 2 or 3 mechanics, you need to know that all of those are versatile, else the level might end up feeling either repetitive or you have to insert a bunch other mechanics afterwards, and that's going to make production very upset. It also helps to solve a number of hard problems early on. If you wait until you're making a full level to test a cool new feature, you might run into problems that are very hard to foresee on paper. Things like depth perception, how slow or fast your player actually is, things being obscured by the camera. If you make some small motifs with the feature that you want to test first, you can find out what those problems are and solve them before you actually get into level designing. And once you're actually level designing, you might be able to avoid encountering any of those problems because you know that they exist. And finally, it also helps for everybody involved with a feature to see examples of how this particular level, how this particular feature is planned to be used by level design. So other disciplines will be aware of what your expectations are, and when the feature is complete, and they have some good use cases to test their own work against as well. Now, of course, this is very useful early on in development just to prove out core areas of the game, that they're interesting, that they're working. But it can also be helpful to make some motifs whenever new gameplay is introduced to ensure that this does what you're looking for. It fulfills the goals that you want it to fulfill. Now, you may think this sounds like a lot of prototyping, and you're not really wrong. Motifing usually involves quite a lot of prototyping, but the level motifs themselves are more about proving that the gameplay does what you're looking for. You're not trying to prove that certain technical or artistic things are possible. You're trying to prove that this gameplay works and it adds to our game what we want it to add. While it usually involves some new technology, it might not always be necessary. You might be able to create new gameplay with existing features, slight alterations, or simply because this is still very much a testing phase, you might be able to use this motif and just say to the player or whoever you get testing this, hey, don't jump for this particular section, and then you test whether that type of gameplay is interesting at all. You don't necessarily have to remove the jump button. So I told you to get back to Titanfall 2. They use a process that they called action blocking, and one of their level designers did a talk about this at GDC 2018, which I would definitely recommend watching. The title is in the lower left of the screen. It's essentially, they used a form of motifing to prove out gameplay, and they used it to figure out what gameplay to pursue and what not to. So for example, Titanfall 2 has a first-person shooter. Basically, you just have the humans, kind of the standard humans running around with guns, but they also have this giant exoskeletons that can be piloted called Titans. And they wanted to know if it's feasible for them to make interesting gameplay where you have Titans fighting against humans within their single-player version of this game. And after trying a number of different things, they decided that this was going to have too many problems. So they decided to cut the idea of having Titans and normal humans fight against each other in their single player campaign. And that saved them a ton of time, because if they hadn't figured that out early on, they would be setting everything up to make sure that that would be feasible, that it would work. And then later, maybe a year later, they would finally figure out that this was causing too many problems. And in figuring this out early, they saved just so much time. So now we can prove out gameplay with motifs. Let's talk about building levels with them. Now, obviously, every different studio has their own level design process. Every different project sometimes has their own level design process. And so this is not super accurate representation of how they're all going to be made. But roughly after getting the requirements for a level, you normally go into some kind of preparation phase, which may involve brainstorming, writing out level pitch documents, potentially drawing out a map or making a flowchart of the level that you want to create. And then you go into a greybox version. You make the geometry, add gameplay, and you iterate on that until you finally, get a final result that works really well. And then you move on to an art pass. It's not a bad process. And obviously, again, every studio has their own version of this. It doesn't look as simple as this. It's quite a basic format. But let's look at this with motifs involved. Obviously, the main difference that you see is that there are more steps involved, and that after your preparation phase, you don't immediately go into building your gray box, building your level, but instead you make these motifs, and you already start testing and iterating on those in isolation. So I'll talk a lot more about these steps in detail soon, but essentially, you create and work out a lot of smaller pieces before combining it into a full level. And that's also what my previous lead and the creative director at Your Motifs Games, JC, put quite nicely. He said, for me, it's all about elemental design, being able to isolate and prove out gameplay before putting it into the bigger picture. And that's essentially the first reason why you might want to use motifs in your level design workflow. It kind of gets rid of the blank canvas problem you might have when suddenly you have to create an entire level and you have to make the entire thing. This lets you start a lot smaller first, make some motifs, and then make the level out of that later. It also means that the level that you make is full of gameplay, and these weren't just the first gameplay concepts that you had in mind, but they have been selected out of many cool ideas, then they've been iterated on, and they've been reviewed a number of times before they were finally put together. So the goal is, if everything goes well, that you have some absolutely amazing gameplay within these levels that you end up with. Motifs can also be useful if your level is lacking something. For example, if your level is too slow or has too much of the same type of content. For example, you're making a shooter game where so far all you have are enemy encounters. you can use motifs to create some platforming or puzzle challenges and then fix the pacing by fitting that somewhere within the layout, within the progress. Now, one thing that's good to realize is that you are, while you're discarding a lot of motifs you make every time that you select one, you want to select the best or the thing that's most useful in that particular situation. All the motifs that you discard are often still quite valid gameplay ideas that you can reuse or repurpose in other situations. So you actually start building up this library of ideas that are probably pretty good, but you've just not used them yet. And that can help you add more content later to the game. You can basically draw from that later in development. And lastly, essentially all of the benefits that I mentioned earlier when using motifs to prove out gameplay, they're also relevant here. The initial motifs that you make for this level, they can be used to just prove out and iterate on mechanics that you want to use within that level. And then you can use that to inform whether you still need to change some of those mechanics. Now, this is not a perfect process. There's obviously downsides. And one of them is that this process can be pretty lengthy. Adding in more steps usually means that you simply get to the end slower. So in this situation, it means that you get to a level that's playable from start to finish quite a bit later in the process. And obviously the aim of using motifs is to make the gameplay in that level much better. But if you simply don't have the time, it's not very helpful to end up with half a level that has potentially better gameplay than a level you could have finished. Near the end of the process, you also have to combine all the motifs that you like into a layout, which we usually refer to as the layout phase. And this is quite different from your usual greybox phase. This, when you're using your making a layout based on motifs, there's a different kind of puzzling and problem solving that you have to do to get all of these pieces working together while also making it look good, feel like a good space, and all of the other things that you normally do making some kind of a greybox. And also very importantly, you're testing a lot of these motifs in isolation for a long time, which means they might be amazing by themselves, but you can't tell how well they all work together until you actually start playing them all in a row. So it's good to be aware of that, and it's good to make sure that within your process, you get to such a point at a decent point in time. So now we're actually going to talk about creating motifs. I'm going to go through essentially a rough version of a process that I've used at some of the companies I worked at. But I do want to clarify this is more guidelines and abstract version of it than a practical, hey, do these steps. You might find benefit in using a couple of these steps, maybe leaving some of them out, maybe changing the order of some things, anything like that. That's always fine. We actually did that quite a bit when we were working on this, and we figured out something wasn't working. We would change a bit of the process. So first step, after you have gotten your level theme, your very rough requirements, is the brainstorming stage. Goal is very straightforward at this point. We want to have a lot of cool motif ideas, and depending on how many ideas we generate, it's good to make a selection of all of the highlights, so it's very clear what we want to focus on when we're making motifs later. A couple of tips. First of all, brainstorming in a group is great. We have multiple people working on the same level, whether they be designers, artists, programmers, they could get involved. Brainstorming together also means that you have a very clear idea of how everybody is expecting to use the mechanics. For example, if you have multiple designers working on the same level, you might hear that other people had different interpretations of how a mechanic might work. And that can be useful, can be inspiring as well. Secondly, drawing motifs and explaining them to other team members is very nice to visually show what you actually have in mind. And even if you're not showing or explaining them to anyone else, I would still advise drawing out your motifs, because then you can actually visualize how they are meant to work, and that might already help you find some problems, perhaps even find some motifs that make no sense without having to do anything in the engine. Then you can also use a mind map or a matrix to figure out all the different kind of mechanic combinations, all the interesting dynamics that the players could interact with within this level. And that can help you out if you want to be just super thorough, or if you're not immediately inspired, you don't necessarily come up with ideas right away. This can be very helpful to either get that started or be super thorough and just come up with all of the dynamics that theoretically could exist within this level, and then use those for your motif ideas. So after we've done the brainstorming stage, we go on to freeform motifing. Goal here, again, very simple, just generate a lot of motifs. We focus on some of the more interesting ideas that came out of the brainstorm. And of course, you're trying to stay within the level requirements, but it's called freeform because it's just very experimental. As mentioned in the steps here, hack or request any functionality or changes to functionality that you need, and just try a lot of cool ideas within the engine. Quite a couple of tips I have for this particular stage, because this is really just about making motifs in general. The first tip is to start simple. If you are making a level about lasers and you want to make a motif that has 5 lasers spinning at different speeds in different directions, just first do a motif with a single laser. It's first of all nice to finish something, and you also might be able to just copy over that setup for any of your future laser motifs. You don't have to copy over your 5 laser motif, remove 4 lasers every time you want to make something new. So that saves you a lot of time. Now, this is also a very experimental stage, as I said, so functionality can be inconsistent. Again, working with lasers, you might want to try a motif where your character can actually serve across a laser, which could be pretty cool. And then you see how it will work if your character just straight up dies from a laser. It allows you to find some cool possibilities if you're not too rigid with how mechanics are supposed to work. Maybe you can find some cool different things that you can do with your mechanics. Probably the biggest tip on this list is not to be too precious with your motifs, because you're probably going to throw away 90%, if not more, of your motifs, and that is totally fine, because every motif that you make helps define what kind of gameplay is and isn't going to be relevant for this particular level, and either one of those is actually pretty useful to know. Now, because you won't be using a lot of these motifs, you should be quite efficient with making them, so limit the amount of art that you're putting into it. Don't make them too pretty, because they don't need to be. They're just mostly about the gameplay. Depending on the game, though, you probably do want to add in a bit of context, especially if it's something that's a little bit more on the realistic, real-world side. On the lower right, you see an image with some pipes. The scaffolding might already be a little bit overkill if you're making like really quick motifs. But already thinking about what certain platforms are really helps a lot when you're continuing with these motifs later, so that you have some context as to where this could take place. Then add an object at the start and the end of your motif. You might know where you're supposed to start and where you're supposed to end, but your colleagues will not, and this will make everybody's lives so much easier, and that will help a lot with the next step tip, which is playtesting and reviewing your motifs regularly. Testing within the design team is great. Getting other people from the team, especially people that haven't played the game that much, can also be really fantastic, because then that allows you to see issues and tweak difficulty based on people that, you know, might be a little bit closer to the actual player. So at this point, there's also a couple of things that you want to just consider, that you want to keep in mind. You want to already start getting your metrics right, because the gameplay needs to feel good. And because you're making motifs quickly and efficiently, it's good to have a nice workflow that includes some default objects. So something that represents your maximum jump height, something that represents your maximum jump distance, perhaps if it's important, the amount, distance someone can travel within a second or something, if they have to dodge, anything like that. Make objects like that to just improve your process. Then ensuring skills are consistent is also quite important. Being able to paste around just a model of the player can really help with this, or again, some other like default objects that I can use as reference for the scale. And then affordances, readability, and shape language are also already relevant, because you want to make sure that the player is interacting with the right thing. And this also feeds into the idea of you still being able to iterate on some of the mechanics that you're using in your level. And this is kind of a perfect part of the process to figure that out. If a mechanic isn't clear enough, you can fix it now. After freeform motifing, we're going to select and review what we got. It's pretty straightforward, but I think it's still important to cover. The main goal here is 3 things. First, you want to have a selection of motifs that you will be continuing with. Then you want to have the actual feedback of how are these motifs that you're continuing with going to be improved so that they can work well in the final level. And thirdly, you want to know what kind of gameplay you're still missing. Before this, you basically have a full feature set of everything you need within this level. While you're working on this, I think it's important that everybody involved plays the actual motifs themselves, because seeing someone show off their motif is entirely different from trying to do it yourself. Somebody can make it look very easy and super fluid, and then you try it yourself and it's horrible. So everybody plays it, and then however you decide on the initial selection, it's very useful to then review the selection that's been made. So discuss progression, discuss, as I said, what's still missing. Some more tips: you obviously want to select the best motifs at this stage, but do keep progression and diversity in mind. You probably want a couple of motifs per mechanic. So if one particular mechanic doesn't actually have any good motifs for it, that's still a part of the gameplay that you're missing. If you're picking motifs that have different implementations of the same mechanic, so for example, that laser you can surf on and then later it might kill you, if you want to implement both of those motifs within your actual level, make sure that that's being thought through. Different lasers may be something you can unlock later that allows you to interact with things differently. And lastly, very important for production, motifs are cheap to make. So you may very quickly end up with 30 motifs, 20 of which you think are the absolute awesomest bits of gameplay. But actually working these out might not be feasible. So it's good to keep that in mind and go for quality over quantity, so you don't burn out your team just because there were so many cool motifs which had so many awesome gameplay ideas that you wanted to put everything into the level. After you've made your selection, we're going to the focus motifing step, which is really the final motifing step. This is where you try and complete the list of motifs that you can use basically to make a full level. Now, you might have seen the small little diagram I have on the bottom right. Something that's not very clearly shown over there is that this particular phase overlaps, or maybe even starts at the same time as the layout phase. So that's quite important because they complement each other a lot. Mechanics at this point, they can't be inconsistent anymore. Any deviation needs to be very clearly communicated. Every mechanic needs to be introduced well, so you may have to make some new motifs to make sure everything is introduced, that it wasn't introduced before, that you don't expect the player to know right away. And here you want to very regularly step back, take a look at whether everything works, keep testing the motifs by themselves, but also regularly test everything in context with all of the other motifs. Bunch of things to consider here. Quickly going through them, mood is already good to start thinking about because you now have an idea of the progression of how people are going to play through this level. Intentionality can be very important. Does the player know where they're going? Do they know what they're actually aiming to do? And do you want them to know where they're going and what they're aiming to do? If you have multiple motifs using the same mechanics or objects, can you set it up so that they actually use the same thing to make everything feel really connected? For example, if you have two vehicle motifs that you made that are really cool, perhaps you can feature the first motif very early on in your level, then do something else for a while, and then later on you open a gate, retrieve your earlier vehicle, and you continue, and it feels like everything is nicely connected and lined up. Then your level may have some required areas. For example, your entrance needs to have some kind of setup with an overview shot of the level or the entire environment. You may have certain story points, story beats that need to be addressed within the level, and there may be secrets or a final moment that you end the level on some epic, get to the helicopter type of scenario. You need to make sure that you've got at least ideas for all of these so that you have all of the content that your level actually needs. And then we go on to the layout phase. Our goal here is really just to get a finished gray box at the end that incorporates all of the motifs that we want to have. So initially we can just paste the motifs one by one into a row. And this is really just to test out the pacing. We usually call this smash together because you literally just smash the motifs together, grab the end from the first one, the beginning of the second one, put them next to each other and roughly make that work. Then you would do an initial pass. You start moving all of the motifs around. You try and create a good layout that feels like an actual cohesive space. And then you keep iterating on it. As mentioned before, pacing problems can be tricky with this level design process because they only show up kind of in this phase. So it's good to make one of those smash togethers early on, perhaps even right after you've chosen your freeform motifs, so that you're aware of pacing and flow problems at a nice point in the process, and you don't get to it all the way at the end and have to go back a few steps. Hopefully all of the motifs that have been made have only minimal art, but simplifying it even more makes it easy to quickly move things around. Just making some buckets to represent certain motifs, for me, helps a lot to avoid the feeling that everything still has to work. The entrances and exits need to line up and everything. You don't have to worry about that if you're just moving around big boxes. Because as the next point basically says, breaking everything here is fine. You made the motifs to get the general gameplay idea fleshed out, not to perfectly slot them into the level and just be done with it. You will have to fix everything up after you find a layout that you like, But first, you have to find something that works as a very good space. Your first version will probably have problems, at least mine always does. So don't be too precious with your layout too early. Perhaps try making a completely different shape. For example, you've tried and made something that feels a bit like a valley setup. Try and make something that's more of a mountain, maybe actually takes place inside of a structure, whether it is a factory, a house, or anything like that. See what works best. And then for every one of these steps in the motifing process, it can be very helpful to have another designer kind of have their eyes on it, or maybe even take over entirely. But I feel like especially here, it can be very helpful to have another designer take over, because it's sometimes hard to see other options once you've got a layout in mind, which you probably do because you have been making all of these motifs. And while you've been making them, because you're a level designer, you're going to be thinking, oh, how is this one going to work in relation to this one? And your mind might already be kind of stuck in a certain layout, while a fresh designer kind of might have fresh eyes and see some other really cool options that you hadn't considered. At this point, you want to consider everything. You want to consider everything you normally keep in mind during greybox or level design in general. So landmarks, vantage points, you want to use loops and shortcuts to add to the feeling that this is one space that they're moving through, not just a straightforward design level. And all of the tricks for guiding players are good to be aware of as well. You want to keep your golden and your optimal paths in mind. So yeah, essentially everything related to level design, everything that's important for levels within your game. And after this, you hand it off to the artist, and the process is essentially the same as if you weren't using motifs. You'll just be working with the artist to make sure levels start looking awesome without breaking any of the level design intent that you made it. So those are all of these steps. Now we can actually use them to make a level. So if I take another sip of water, I can show you a little example that I prepared. So I grabbed one of my existing prototypes that I had laying around, and I decided to go through the motifing process that I just described to make a level for this little prototype. Now, this little game itself takes place in a fairly simple 2D top-down dungeon based on a grid. You can only move up, down, left, and right, attack enemies by moving into them. And within this level, I wanted to introduce the player to these kind of ogre enemies. They attack you if you're standing right next to them, and they randomly choose between attacking in your direction, which reaches a little bit further, or smashing down on the ground, which damages all the tiles around the ogre. And that's essentially the setup. So let's try and make a level for that. All right, so first step, motif brainstorm. My goal is to introduce monsters, so I've drawn a bunch of little situations where the player interacts with those monsters. I've got ideas for mainly 3 types of scenarios: avoiding the monsters entirely, trying to dodge their attacks, or trying to actually defeat them. There's some ideas about giving the player more or less safe areas about when they're fighting monsters. And I also want to try a motif where the player can see ahead a little bit, so they can maybe find out how to kind of rush through an area before they actually have to do so they can just kind of look ahead and plan. I've drawn all of this on physical paper rather than digital paper because, digital paper rather than a digital drawing program, because I get a lot less distracted when I do that. And if you feel like that might help you, I would definitely recommend it, because it's also nice not to just not stare at a screen throughout your entire day. So with that, we're going on to the freeform motifing. When I was drawing out those motifs, I had those 3 different interactions: avoiding, dodging, and defeating the monsters. So I made different sets of motifs for each of these dynamics. On the left, there's some monsters you can avoid. The bottom 2 essentially have you sidestep a monster. The top one is a little bit more tense, where you actually have to find the right path to avoid triggering any of these monsters. Then in the middle square, you can see I've made some motifs about dodging attacks. You can see the top 2 are actually already iterations of some of the little motifs that were right underneath it. And then on the right, I have some motifs about actually having to fight some monsters and defeat them. One interesting thing about this particular phase is that already at this point, even though I'm making a very simple 2D game, playing it with a game camera is a really good exercise. Because in this motif, for example, the idea was that you can see ahead and make a bit of a planning on how you're going to pass all of these monsters. And it works, you can kind of see ahead, but you can only see the legs of the upper monsters. So if I would have another row with some more monsters above it, you really wouldn't be able to tell. And you can't actually tell if there is more above this or not. Now, obviously, this is a very simple 2D game. For 3D games, this is much more important to keep in mind because the camera can do a lot more things. It's a lot less constrained. So now it's time to select some motifs. I quite like the one where you're avoiding enemies at the top left that you see. It feels very sneaky and a bit tense to kind of go by all of these enemies. Then I like the bottom one. Let me quickly point them out. I like this one more than the one on the left because this one kind of doesn't have as many walls in front of the ogre, which makes him feel more dangerous, even though there's really not that much of a difference. Then over here, I really quite liked this particular shape for the dodge motifs because this has essentially the perfect shape for the ogre's range. If you rush by it and you want to quickly get into this this hole, if you see that he's doing a smash attack around him, but if you actually go by here and he attacks you in your direction, then that hole isn't actually safe. So then you want to you want to avoid that. And I basically felt like this played quite nicely on the on the mechanic of the ogres. Oh, going a bit too far. Then this one over here shows basically it has the two different paths. The upper one basically just has an extra safe space, but it also has an extra monster that you have to keep in mind. And then the bottom one you can rush through if you see that he's doing his directional attack at you. But if you do that one wrong and he does his smash attack, then basically you're dead because you're not going to make it in time. And then on the right, I've got the just kind of a nice open space to face off with an ogre, probably good for a first encounter. And then on the right, I like this motif a bit more than the one left of it because it just has a bit more space, which gives you more space to avoid damage, but also more ways to mess up, which I think is fun. So I took a look at that selection that I just made, and I realized that there wasn't a lot of opportunity for these areas to connect and feel like a bigger space. So I thought one area where you can actually see monsters that happen in a later part of the level would be cool. Then I started thinking about how a lot of the gameplay that I have and that I like in this level is about dodging and not necessarily fighting monsters. So maybe I only give the player a weapon later. So this actually means that I can also add in monsters in places that in the beginning you can't cross, because later you'll be able to defeat them, and then that will form basically a shortcut. So that can feel pretty cool, feel like you're really making progress, a bit of a Metroidvania type feeling. Now, I'm not actually making any new functionality. I'm just working in a little level editor that I previously made. So I'm not making any new functionality to disable the weapon. I'll just pretend the weapon doesn't work until I step on this button over here. And when this button actually is stepped on, it will spawn a monster, immediately requiring the player to learn about defeating monsters in order to progress. The motif I selected also didn't have a lot of fighting gameplay, so I added some motifs with that. And I previously dropped a motif because it was way too difficult, but now it actually makes a return because it will be used as a secret area where you can get some loot, which will be a bonus. Since it's optional, it's fine that it is quite a bit difficult. So with all of this, I think I have all of the motifs that I need to create a level, and this is what it ended up looking like. If you can see, I put together a whole bunch of these different motifs into an actual layout. And if you paid close attention, you might still be able to recognize a bunch of the motifs that I made in it. If you didn't recognize all of them, here they are. Excuse the mess of lines. You can still identify where they come from, although a lot have been rotated or modified in some way, which is kind of perfect. This is exactly what we want to do in the layout phase, because we want to find something that works as a cohesive space while still including a lot of these gameplay ideas. So even though there's not a whole lot of context going on within this setup, it's just got walls and floors, it still feels like there are some defined rooms and paths. And here's a little video of me playing through it. Because you get back to the beginning after you get the sword and then being able to use it to create a few shortcuts, the spaces feel quite connected and they feel a lot less linear, which I think is a pretty cool feature in this extremely simplistic setup. You see the boss, a little bit difficult. I died a couple of times. That's probably fine. All right, so when I started this presentation, I actually wanted to have a very quick mock-up within this little prototype of just a mock-up level for one of the slides. And that's the image that you see on the right. I used that in one of my very first slides. And I only spent about 10 minutes on this, but I did actually try to make this into an actual level that you would look at this and go, oh yeah, sure, that's an all right level. Looking at it again now, it's very bad. It's a horrible level. I don't make use of you being able to avoid enemies at all. There's only a few times where you dodge enemies. And if you take the lower path, you just have to repeatedly defeat enemies in a very similar way. So it just kind of feel very repetitive. And then for the upper path, I actually wasn't sure what to do anymore with the monsters, with the ogres. So I added in an entirely different mechanic. The level I made using motifs, I think, is so much better because I actually found all of these interesting ways to interact with enemies. I iterated on them and then I put them together rather than just trying to make the entire thing in one go. Now, take that with a grain of salt. Obviously, the right side took me about 10 minutes. The left side might have been an hour or two, but I still found it an interesting result because I legit did although very quickly, I legitimately did try for the right one. But without a good process, it was pretty hard to come up with anything good. So that's it. 6 easy steps to put motifs in your levels. That would have been a good clickbait title if people knew what level motifing was. So this is an overview. Feel free to take a screenshot if you so desire. With that, thank you very much for listening. I see there is chat. So yeah, also feel free to ask any questions. Yep, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Raymond. That was a really interesting talk. Yeah, like as I just said, if you have any questions, now's a good time to ask them. I've got some in case there's time, but yeah, we still have a lot of time. So let's see, you can use the chat or you can just unmute yourself and talk freely. So Raymond, the first thing that I wondered when you rendered and I wrote it in chat is the concept of motifs seems similar to the I think it's pronounced end piece. I'm not sure actually. It's just this. I have this. If you click on the link, you see it on TV tropes to the right. The Super Mario level, the classic, having this set of stairs once without the bottomless pit at the end, and then a second time later with the bottomless pit. And this concept of like having a small challenge in a game that is reusable and that you can make more difficult, or you can tweak a little and change it up a little.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've definitely come across this term before, but I wasn't working on this presentation at the time. They're definitely associated, as in these kind of antipieces could be what you make as motifs. So when we generally make motifs, we have like, I would say a row of maybe 20 motifs that are all just iterations on something. And if you're making a longer level that something like Sackboy Big Adventure, you might have 5 different versions of using the exact same piece, but just, yeah, exactly. Like here you add something that also fires at you while you're completing it. And here you add, that instead of just falling a meter down and you can just jump right back up, you actually fall to your death. So that's essentially from what I'm very quickly skipping through this article, but that's what antipieces is about, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So essentially, with the level motifing process, you might make a number of these. When you're making the motifs themselves, you're just trying out a whole bunch of these versions, and you see what works. And then, especially in the I would say in the focus motifing stage, you start to figure out, hey, is this too difficult? Like, is this hard at this point in the level? Because then you might use some of the motifs, kind of like these antipieces that you've brought up earlier in the level, to introduce how this is used, how to interact with this type of mechanic, or this type of level design, I guess is a better way to put it.
I see. And so something that you earlier you crossed out in the things about motifs is the repetition, or like the that you maybe recognize something about a motif, and then when it shows up again. And that's something that I thought end pieces, like, they're designed to do that, right? They're designed, you're designed to recognize them if you pay attention.
Yeah, for sure. That makes a lot of sense.
Is that when you use level motifs? So when you iterate on the same basic idea, and you say, okay, here's a hard version of that, here's an easier version of that. Is it something you keep in mind, such that you can say, all right, this is level 3. We want this level motif in the 3 different versions of difficulty that we have in that order. So that first is the easiest, and at the end it's the hardest version of that.
You could do something like that, but obviously level design is usually not as neat. It's usually not we have 3 versions of this mechanic or this antipiece that is like a repetitive interaction, but every time it is slightly different. It's slightly more difficult, or it's either, it's a different way, it's a twist on it. It usually just really depends on the mechanics. Usually it depends on the level. So you can definitely try and have some maybe not necessarily rules, but kind of guidelines for the level designers to be like, hey, if we have this cool moment, can we repeat it a number of times? If it's difficult, we can maybe split it up and let the player get accustomed to it slowly. Mm-hmm. But it really depends. Because sometimes when you have done something once, it's just not fun to do it right away afterwards. Yeah. Sometimes it just really fucks with the pacing. If you are, I'm not sure if you're gonna leave this out, I swear. But sometimes it really messes with the pacing if you're, if you try and make something repeat and you introduce it really gradually, can be cool. But yeah. It really depends on what you're making. So also what you said about how, motifing, kind of the term motifs in general in different media includes that they're often something that's repeated, and they're often something that has metaphorical meaning. The reason that I crossed that out in the presentation is because when I'm talking about level motifs, they don't need to have that. They could have that. They could be something that you repeat, and it could actually be that you attach some kind of story significance to maybe a certain set piece that you use in some of the motifs, but you don't have to. That's not really part of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about level motifs.
I see. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Cool.
Right, let's see if we got anyone else. I don't want to. Yeah. Okay. Then quickly for me again. On one of your slides, you said that when you do the layouting of the level, you have to keep in mind the golden path and the optimal path. Mm-hmm. And I don't know what, I mean, I think I know what the optimal path is, but I don't. Could you just explain what the difference is between those two?
Right. To be honest, I'm always slightly confused by that as well. But they're pretty good. So I think the golden path is what you want them to do. The optimal path would be the actual most efficient way to get through a level. The
speed run.
Basically either the speed run, or it doesn't necessarily have to be speed run. Like, you don't necessarily think about, they can wall clip over there and then get over there. But it's more like, we lay out all of these collectibles here so that they follow this nice path. But if they want to, they can go like that, and they're faster, and they're they're efficient, and both work, and it's all that all works well.
Okay, and golden path is kind of like see everything in the level once. Something like that.
Yeah, well, it's kind of, you want them to follow this. So whether that means seeing everything, or whether that means, you see a whole bunch, and then actually you see, you get to a nice vantage point, and you see that you have missed on some things, because you want them to be kind of surprised. Oh, there's still more. They want to backtrack a little bit, find other things. Essentially how you want them to move through your level.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. That's good to know.
I'm now going to Google it to make sure I've explained that somewhat decently.
All right, I think it's fine, even if it's not. It's good to know that there's terms for that, and that one can look them up. So overall, when you explained motifs, I thought That sounds a lot like what a game mechanic designer, the core game, the character controller designer maybe would do. Like I'm thinking a platformer game, and I say my character's gonna have a hook shot, so I'm gonna implement the basic hook shot, and then I'm gonna say, okay, to test this, I'm gonna build this. I think you called it a gym. And I'm gonna say, we're gonna put some blocks up here, and then you can hook shot on them, and then so the next step in this, if I'm the game designer of this hypothetical game, is okay, I'm gonna build a few like incredibly short level pieces that that show how the hook shot can be used, for example.
Sure.
And is that like the first step towards building motifs?
It depends. You could put it that way. Obviously, the way that I lined it out in that whole process, you would already have either you would already have some functionality. So someone else might have done what you just mentioned, where they designed like the hook shot. They designed you can use it as a grappling hook. You can use it to pull stuff, and that stuff is there, that exists. Then you want to make a level out of it. So you start basically first doing that brainstorming. So I mean, you could just go ahead and play with it, right? You could just go ahead, make a whole bunch of different cool things with it, but you could also start brainstorming, you know, what can I grab? Can I pull heavy things around? Do I maybe pull over some pillar or something because it attaches to the top? I make a bridge. Small ideas like that. You start listing out a whole bunch of those, and then you can start making things like that. Obviously, you know, you don't have to do a motifing stage. You can just go for it and try and just make a bunch of stuff in the actual editor, in the actual level. So yeah, so that would also be a perfectly fine way to make motifs. But yeah, but I do think it's good to I guess have a difference between what your playground and your motifs are. But it's a bit tricky because the line, you know, it blends, right? Because you've got a playground where you're just testing, hey, I can jump, I can use the hook shot to now grapple onto something, and then I can swing over here and I can land over here. Cool. Now I just have the nice metrics. I know that I can do this type of thing. So that might work as a motif, as like a very simple motif. Depending on your game, you might want your motifs to be a little bit more elaborate. So you might want it to be like you get onto the whatever you're swinging off, and then while you are doing that, the thing goes up, or the thing goes down, or the thing moves, or anything like that. Or you have to actually first activate something. You have to like pull something down before you can use it to swing on, anything like that. Just a small little puzzle, essentially, small setup. So yeah, they blend into each other, is I guess my answer.
That makes perfect sense. I just I guess my thinking was that like that sounds very like this design is bottom up. I'm starting at the game design, starting at the core mechanic, the very simple end piece of like, okay, the very simple mechanic implementation of, okay, the hookshot can do this, and then now I start and branch out and say, okay, let's make it a little bit more complex until I have a bunch of motifs, like you said, in the freeform phase. And then I build a whole level instead of going at it top down and saying like, all right, I want my level to have this theme and to have this happen in it. And now how do I make the little pieces inside of it?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so it's super focused on the gameplay. Obviously, if your gameplay has to all kind of derive from this bigger theme and you want it all to have a metaphorical meaning, because, you know, everything, for example, if you're making like Gree or something, that game about, well, grief, and you know, all of the different mechanics. I mean, you could definitely make motifs for that, because you can have the original like level requirements be, hey, all of the different mechanics that we use, all of the different motifs that we do have to have something to do with this particular emotion that we're trying to express.
Yeah.
And then, you know, you start thinking, we have these base mechanics, how do we connect them to this kind of theme? So how do we make, I think in Gree you can turn into like a cube. How do we make turning into like a specific shape? How do we make that feel like you're struggling against some like almost unovercomable force? Well, maybe if you turn into a cube, you're really heavy. So you have the wind blowing every once in a while. And if you don't turn into a cube, you're blown away. And then you connect it and you try and integrate that into it. So I guess it would be more in the motifing that, sorry, in the brainstorming that you just really basically include that in your requirements. Like it has to be part of whatever kind of motifs you're making.
I actually really like that about your your example with your top-down turn-based puzzle roguelike Metroidvania game that you figured out that you can dodge. Like that was basically a new information that came about in the motifing stage, and then you were able to figure out and say, all right, if dodging is a core mechanic of this game suddenly, because you have all these motifs, then you can say, all right, then at the beginning you're weak and you feel weak and scared of the enemies because they can hurt you and etc. And so I think you can use that also to do this emotional design, this game experience design that a game like Gree would do.
Yeah, let's really figure out what your mechanics can do. So I do see that Daniel has his hand raised.
Oh yeah, I was just wondering, this motif structure is obviously very useful if you have a level kind of setup.
Mm-hmm.
So how would you include that when it's more of an open world type of game?
Yeah, no, that's fair. I definitely think you can still use something like it. When you are making an open world type game, let's say Breath of the Wild, right? Like that's a great,
yeah.
I guess in every situation you've got Breath of the Wild as an example of open world games. They've got all of these like Korok challenge, where you've got just this small and little environmental puzzle. You have to jump into a ring of leaves or something. You can just make a whole ton of motifs for just that little interaction of jumping into some leaves. Now obviously if you then put those into the game, you're not thinking just, oh, I'm making this one level, how am I going to put all of these motifs in there to have the right type of progression? You're doing it quite differently. You're making it much more, all of them have to be pretty much feasible the moment that you start the game, the moment you encounter any one of them. You have to be able to understand enough that you can complete all of them. So it's a bit of a different challenge, but you can still definitely use something like motifing. And it wouldn't surprise me if they did it to some degree in that way. It might of course be that they just made some drawings or just listed out some ideas of, oh, hey, this is how you could interact with some of these core challenges and how you can do it in all of these different ways. So it's less of a, so it doesn't repetitive, because obviously that's one of the core problems that a lot of open world games have, is that they feel repetitive because you keep encountering the same thing. So if you make a whole ton of motifs and they're all slight variations on the same thing, then whenever you encounter that, you're less like, oh man, it's another one of those stupid leaves that I have to jump into. You're more like, oh cool, I've seen that before, I've done that before, but is there something different? Do I have to do something different now? Yeah, I hope that kind of answers your question.
Yeah.
Cool.
So it's all just about having easier access to variation, right?
Well, in that particular situation, if you're working for, an open world game, then essentially, yeah, but it's also it's a lot about selecting the best stuff, right?
Oh,
so
yeah.
you make 100 motifs with Korok seeds and whatnot, and then you figure out 50 of them, yeah, they work, but they don't feel super nice. So then you focus on the ones that work really well, that feel really nice, stuff like that. So I've also been thinking about how this would make a lot of sense in things like procedurally generated games, because maybe not fully procedurally generated, but essentially a lot of games that have randomized levels or randomized content do have little chunks. So you make like a nice little chunk of gameplay, and that can essentially be as small as a motif. It can just be like this small little jump with some bounce pad or with a grappling hook or something. You could do it like this. So obviously I haven't worked on anything like that, but I think a motifing process like this could be quite useful for something like that as well. Cool. If we have any other questions,
I wondered just now when you said especially for an open world game, having all these motifs. How do you going a bit in the technical direction here? How do you like your setup to be such that if you use Unity or Unreal or whatever, like, do you want each of your motifs to be one theme that you can just say, I have 100 motifs and I can start any of them right now without any setup and without any hassle? Or like, how do you want to go about that?
Yeah, so there's a number of different things. When I've worked with other level designers and we all make motifs in the past, we all have a slightly different way that, you know, we lay out our motifs and whatnot. But most of the time, what I do, and what I've also noticed a lot of other people do, is, you know, you have your motifs in a big empty void floating in space, right? So you've got your one motif over here, and it's like, I don't know, it's some jump. And then you've got another motif over here, and it's something, it can be something different. Like, it's for the same level, but this is something you like. Let's say it's like God of War. It's like using Kratos as X to open a door or something. You've got that over here. And then you think, oh, okay, I can use Kratos' axe to open a door. Maybe I can use Kratos' axe to pull a lever. And then you make it, instead of like continuing this row of completely pretty much different motifs, you make one to the side of it. And you're like, oh, this is kind of just an iteration of the previous one.
It's like a brainstorm map is what you have in the end there.
Brainstorm map, yeah. It's just basically, these are all ideas that relate to, you know, this is what could be in the level. And then you lay them out of, oh, this might be an interesting iteration, or maybe it's just the same thing but slightly better spaced. So you just have obviously at some point you want to delete all the stuff that isn't working, because otherwise it does get really big. But that's kind of what you have in the freeform motifing stage. You just have all of these motifs, some of which are just iterations on what you have made before, because either it didn't work, or maybe, you know, you just had other cool ideas. And that can be something like the ante pieces, not sure, that you talked about, where the first one you made worked, but maybe the second one also has something cool, and maybe you can actually use both. So depends on your game a lot as well. Oh yeah, and then you asked, well, yeah, so a little bit more about technical setup. It is incredibly useful to be able to just fly and click on any motifs and be like, start in this one, because if you have to every time press play and then somehow navigate to the right motif, that's obviously a massive pain. So just set things up so you can start from any of them. And sometimes if you want that kind of, so I was talking about this smash together where you make all of these, you just put motif 1 here, motif 2 here, motif 3 here, etc. You can also actually simplify that process a little bit for yourself by just having the thing that you place at the start and the end of your motifs have some functionality to just teleport you to another motif. So you can just you go through motif 1, and motif 1 is somewhere far off over there, but you just reach the exit of motif 1 and blip, you're at motif 2. And then you can also very easily change the order of things and kind of play with that without necessarily needing to, you know, do too much in the engine.
Yeah. That sounds good. In that case, you couldn't do the layout like what you did in your game, the layouting where you see ahead of the next to the next thing. I guess that's later in the process anyway. But
yeah. So basically, when you select the motifs that you're going for, it's usually helpful to just actually put them together like that. But as I said, seeing everything in a row really does help you figure out pacing problems. And the teleport thing isn't perfect because it you know, you're not going to actually have players teleport within the final game, so it's still going to be a little bit off. It's not going to work as well, but it does give you an indication of, oh, I've just completed 2 massive puzzle rooms and they were super interesting, but they took me a long time, and now I have a 3rd massive puzzle room. You know, as cool as the previous 2 were, I'm like mentally exhausted. I'd like to shoot some baddies or something.
So it's good enough to test the pacing, is what you're saying.
It can be a good like first check, basically, of whether you're on the right track with the pacing, whether it's absolutely horrible or whether it can go. And then later on, you actually smash together the actual motifs, and then you start doing some proper layout. And then, you know, things change. Things will completely change every time, but at least if you do, for example, the teleporting thing, or if you make the smash together, you keep having an idea of, all right, this is something that can work. This is going into a good direction.
All right. Then I think we're done here. Thank you, Raymond.